So I'll begin with this image, which was published in the Daily Mail in 1985 in December. So on the 6th of October 1985, a night of fighting took place on the Broadwater Farm estate in Tottenham, London, between residents and the police. The disturbances were prompted by the death of a local black mother, Cynthia Jarrett, who had died the day before after a police raid on her home in the nearby Thorpe Road. The police had arrived at Jarrett's home looking for stolen goods belonging to her son, Floyd, who had been found driving an unlicensed car and later been charged with assaulting a police officer. Having taken Floyd's keys to his mother's home, DC Randall entered Jarrett's home with 4 other police officers without a warrant, and accidentally pushed the 49-year-old Cynthia to the floor, where she proceeded to have a fatal heart attack. During the subsequent conflict, local police constable Keith Blakelock was stabbed to death, leading to national outrage and widespread press coverage. So today, I'm going to be talking about this photograph, which was taken at Blakelock's funeral, and the way in which whiteness and gender intersected following the death of Blakelock to produce distinct messages about national identity. There's a now significant amount of literature, aided in most part by the work of Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall, which has outlined the unwavering ties between British law and order and race and national identity. The role that newspapers have in producing and reproducing these themes has been established by Hall, Gilroy, as well as other scholars such as Ryan Farney-Gattani, Elliot Cooper, and Alice Butler. These scholars have, for the large part, suggested that British national identity rested on the tabloid celebration of British legality, embodied by the police, and that this discourse rests largely on the vilification or the exclusion of Black individuals. However, in the next 8 minutes or so, I want to look at the other side of the coin through a focus on this image. I will scrutinise what role the cultural construction of whiteness has within this discourse. English national identity is not merely shaped by the exclusion of racialised minorities, but by the reification of a distinct white identity, and one which is, I suggest, gendered. Using this photograph as a launchpad, I'm going to tease out the meanings of white femininity and its relationship to national identity. So most of us here are connected by our interest in visual culture. However, I only came to photography quite recently, as the advent of the pandemic resulted in me switching most of my research to digitized sources. In my research, I have really discovered how many hidden messages can be put across in photojournalism. What cannot be explicitly said in text, particularly in relation to race, can be put forward in photography, if the photo is read correctly, of course. As Sharon Hirsch and David Swanson have suggested, photography allows for the, quote, acknowledgement of race when in contemporary written accounts its existence is denied. So crime had long been a staple of the British popular press, whose close ties with the police shaped the positive portrayal of police officers in the tabloid press. So you'd find that police officers would often give kind of intel on subject matters to the press in return for the sort of sympathetic characterizations of the police. However, by the 1980s, as law and order entered the country's political agenda, following Margaret Thatcher's electoral promise to crack down on crime, crime news served as the arena for right-wing tabloids such as the Mail and the Sun to put forward their own political agenda. Journalists such as the Mail's Richard Littlejohn and Lydia Lee Potter used crime stories involving ethnic minorities to bemoan interventionist anti-discrimination policies, soft policing, anti-racist and social justice campaigners, i.e. the loony left, and state bureaucracy, which they believed had restricted freedom of press, while also leading to anti-white hostility and a breakdown in law and order. Since the 80s, the Broadwater Farm estate, where the conflict took place, had come to represent everything that the tabloids despise. It was mostly self-sufficient, with a thriving youth association that employed local residents to maintain the estate, and it had a minimal police presence. However, the police's implication in the death of Jarrett threw this harmonious relationship into turmoil, and the tabloids set themselves to legitimising the police's actions, like in this photograph. So here we see a young white female police officer crying following the death of her colleague, PC Blakelock. She displays a controlled sadness, her hand delicately wiping away a tear. She is rational, in terms of her emotion is rather rational because her crying is composed, she's not sobbing or bawling. And she's more or less conventionally attractive, demonstrated by her neat and tidy hair. I think what looks to me like it could be a tiny little earring, and supposedly kind of slim figure. As Louise Jackson has noted, female police officers in post-war Britain were not expected to match up to men, but in fact were expected to portray a sort of subtle femininity. For a long while, they wore skirts, and their, quote, natural caring tendencies were deemed essential in forming human contacts and relationships. Female police officers for a long time were kind of the perfect candidates in social work and sort of intervening in prostitute cases regarding prostitution. So in many senses, this unnamed police officer was the perfect female police officer, but her whiteness is also important here in producing what we call white femininity. White femininity, as Kate Deliofsky has shown, is a cultural construction. Deliofsky suggests that white women are made to perform an allegiance to whiteness through their sexual habits or conforming to beauty standards. Moreover, as Rakashome has noted, the portrayal of white femininity can be used to convey meanings of morality, heterosexuality, and domesticity, meanings which, in certain settings, reproduce racialized and patriarchal myths of national identity and essentialism. So, for instance, if we think, for instance, about the example of Princess Diana, whose beauty, femininity, and allegiance to motherhood made her an icon around which the public could unite, both in life and in death. So in Shome's words, white femininity constitutes a central ideological force in the performance of national identity. And so in this photograph, white femininity intersects with ideas around British law and order, produce distinct messages about nationhood. In her complicity to the feminine expectations of police officers, the woman conforms to the emotional standards of the British gender order. Moreover, her assumed kind of fealty to masculine authority, demonstrated by her tears, appeased the viewer. Her feminine emotions humanized the police, challenging the notion that they misbehaved during the disturbances or were implicated in the death of Jarrett. As such, she restores the reputation of Britain as a crucible for law and order. On this intimate moment of female grief rests a nation's sense of self. So very briefly, I've suggested that while the framing of the other was and kind of still is necessary to the cultural construction of what we can term Britishness, so too was the valorization of white femininity within this discourse. Thank you.